Um, this is your first PowerPoint to talk about creativity, and I'm going to give you some idea of what some of the examples are at the very beginning of this course. So it's the very first thing that you watch, and it's the very first thing I show in my classroom. This first picture is the Mona Lisa. I'm sure many of you have seen her and heard about her. She is probably the most famous painting in the world. She's at the Louvre Museum in Paris. As you can see, she actually has her own room. Lots of people go see her. The question asks, art, question mark, what are we appreciating? Why is this the most famous piece in the world? Why is there now no value attached to her anymore? And why is it considered the most creative piece in the world? What's creative about this? This was created by Leonardo da Vinci, probably the most famous artist in the world. And many of you might end up doing a paper about him. He's known for painting. He's known for keeping a journal. Almost 6,000 pages were compiled and found with him after he died. He was about 90 years old when he died, between 80 and 90, very old. He invented things. He invented the tank. He invented the parachute. Just couldn't make it really go because he didn't have the right materials. And he only finished about 10 paintings when he lived. So why do we appreciate this? Why do we think he was creative? I'm going to show you some things here, many things. There's about 20 things here. The first thing I want to talk about is understanding art. To understand art, when you look at anything, we consider these three things, and they're really important. So, and it's something to consider when you consider whether it's art or not. So, the first thing is the content or the subject matter. So you look at it, and we're going to look at the content. Even the next one I'm going to show you. What's the content of it? What's the intent? Why was it done in the first place? Why did the artist want to do it in the first place? And that's an important piece, especially an important piece of it. The context in which it was done, knowledge of the artist, the time in which it was done, the culture in which it was done. Does it explain it? For instance, World War II, you'll see some pictures in one of the chapters, I think it's 21. You have to keep the context, those kinds of questions in your mind, the context in which it was created. If it was created during World War I, that's going to be a very different context and very different images than if it was created during Napoleon's time, for instance, or during the time of today. They're going to look very different. So think of those things. Here is a piece of art. It's in a museum. Some people think, who go to galleries, who buy art, this is sort of what you would call facetious or ridiculous. And I would agree. It's mostly making fun of people who buy art for big amounts of money, so that might make you feel better. Somebody drags this in and you think, well, they put the word fine art on it, so that means it must actually be art. So it's sort of making fun of that idea. Here's an example of being creative about composition, how you compose the picture. Modern artist, this is a photographer obviously, it's intentional how they place everything in this picture, and this is a way modern artists consider how to compose a piece. Very different than it was before. Things don't make sense. They haven't for years, since about the 1800s. Things were a bit more intentional. They want this to be here. They want these other pieces to be here. For one thing, this line, the way it goes here, very intentionally done here to continue this line to repeat lines here, to repeat lines here, vertical, horizontal. These horses have a sort of vertical and horizontal pieces to them. Here's a sort of what you call linear perspective, where this looks correct. This is the way the line should go here. I have no doubt that the photographer arranged these horses to look a particular way so that the black and white sort of balance each other out. Using the different lines of wet and dry here, there's these wet streaks that pick up the light here, so that was intentional. Here's another one, different kinds of art. This is a pretty creative piece. And taking a risk. You're going to see this list in chapter 1 about what is creativity. Doing something that has to do with our culture, the culture of computers that we use every day. This actually looks like a little bit older. So they set up two computers side by side, set up one that would send an email to another computer that they knew was going to say out of office, and then that bounced back, and before it bounced back, they set this one up to also say that. So these actually will continue forever if they're allowed to say out of office. And it's sort of, I say here, it's ironic, funny, making a statement about how we now no longer even talk to each other. You just get this sort of impersonal statement about that person not being there. It used to be, in older days, you would leave a message, and the message was, the recording would say, I'm out of the office for a week. And it used to be before that somebody would answer the phone, a secretary or somebody, and would say that this person's not going to be back, and before that the phone would just ring and you'd hang up. So here is the idea of almost like the garbage can, where you could say that's crap, but there's always going to be somebody who says it's brilliant, and that happens at galleries and museums all the time. So one person will come in and say it's brilliant and pay, $1 million for it, and there's always going to be other people who say it's crap. But is it? Here is literally crap, made large. This is bronze. This is permanent, what's called public art. It means a municipality, some kind of city or county park or state, probably city or county, paid a good deal of money for this. That's usually in the tens of thousands that's paid for public art. This is Andy Warhol's work. You may or may not heard of him. He's a pretty famous guy in the 60s and 70s, 80s. One of his things was how we consume as a nation pretty mundane things. His first piece was a lithograph. You'll learn about printmaking in one of the chapters, of Campbell's soup. Just a huge, very meticulously done duplicate of a Campbell soup can, and eventually he did all of them. Some of them he did, like all of them, in a rectangular form where they were all different, but they were all side by side. These are all done exact duplicates and made into, they're hand done, so they're made into the boxes. And this was his first gallery show. How we consume. This one is done. It may look ridiculous to begin with. The context is World War I. Many of these artists were actually served their country, both Germany and France, and this is the context of World War I. It was insane. 10 million people died in a very pretty finite section of land, Europe, the continent, England, and parts of Middle East, and a great deal of people died during that, and 20 million were displaced or wounded. A lot of the artists came back wounded. A lot of them died, so they weren't just sitting around creating. And it wasn't a time where the artists would have been painting beautiful things because it wasn't, the context was a very grisly environment. So one of the things they thought was necessary was the idea of randomness, that you know, in the next 10 minutes your house could be blown up, and everything was about danger and instability. So they would do things like this, where they would tear paper, throw it on the ground, and wherever it landed is what they either stuck on there and glued and called that the finished piece, or they would paint what was there. The idea of beauty, this is something that artists have always thought about, and it's changed over the centuries and decades. Here is one, this one. This is also during World War I, and you can read these later when you go through them again on your own. This is sort of nailing, the idea of really nailing the idea of trying to make sense of, here, truth. And truth to artists is beautiful, when you can really say something that's true. This is the idea of creating something that is the truth. Now here is war, the face of war, very skeletal, about, you know, destruction. This is actually scraped into here, and it's a contrast of very black with kind of a gold figure here. This is the concept of beauty. We might think it looks very beautiful, very pastoral or outdoors. This was very shocking during its time, because around this time in France, what was considered beautiful then were paintings of very wealthy people, aristocrats with their families, and everything looked very normal. This guy Courbet was painting what he considered very normal people. People who weren't rich bathed outside. That was always the case. They didn't have homes that had indoor bathtubs and things like that. So this is how they bathed, and people didn't want to see that. This is another very common, this is done in the Renaissance, but this has always been considered the ideal of beauty, always, even today, I would say. Blonde woman, very thin. And then here's a feminist, more today, I think this is around 2008, who's making a point with her own body of how women today, and we know this is true, you hear it in the news all the time, who are obsessed with plastic surgery in order to make their face look like this, to make it, if they don't look like that, to make themselves look like that through something as extreme as surgery. Then the intent, to be abstract or to be realistic. So you look in the first chapter, and they describe, possibly in the second chapter, they describe two things, two types of art: representational, which is what you would call realistic, and then abstract. So it's either realistic or it's abstract. So the intention, if your intention is to make something abstract, it's to take away the idea that it looks realistic. So here is an abstract painting. This was done in probably the 80s. They got tired of doing things the way it had always been done, and they started to just play around with color, lack of color. This is just panels of white paint. Now, if you saw this in person, you would actually see different types of textures and things, but just color or absence of color was more interesting to them. In a white room. Here's another abstract piece, just playing with line, just line. This is on house paint with crayon. It's about as cheap as you can use the materials. What he's done though here is not just make these very, very free gestural lines, which is, they also talk about line in chapter 2. He's also smudged out some of these here and there, which makes this not just all looking like it's in the same plane, but he's also, in doing that, there's a sense of depth here, as if these aren't all, some of these are forward He's pushed some of these forward by doing that, and some of them definitely look like they're in the background just by doing that simple thing. Other ways of doing something very modern is to use materials in a very different way. Bee pollen, he just says, I used the pollen or the beeswax, I didn't create it. So using things that are very unexpected in this way, using common brick, but using them very meticulously, installing them in a museum. These are things that are interesting to look at. These are sheets of paper. This is almost sometimes called interactive art, where they want you to actually take pieces with you. Works without an end. These papers can be taken by the viewer and will be replaced endlessly by the gallery. Content. The content here, the subject matter, is interaction with an audience one at a time. This says visitors are invited to sit quietly with the artist one at a time. So this is what a performance art looks like. It is awkward. Part of her point is that we as people, we're so busy now with our lives, we rarely sit and talk with each other. Now we have phones. We will even talk to people without looking at each other. In fact, there's a woman right there. She's got friends with her, and yet she's on her phone. I bet she's talking to them and she's texting at the same time. We do that kind of thing now. And she's kind of making that point. Well, up here, you're not allowed to talk. You're not allowed to do anything, and you have to sit and hold the gaze with the artist. This is street art. This has become one of my favorite things. I used to not like this at all. Let's go forward here. It's one of my favorite things now. I think it's pretty dynamic, and it has to do with our culture, and it's dynamic because it's happening right now, and it's always about there's statements, and I'm not talking about the stuff that is gang related. Some of it has risen out of that, but it's become a little bit more sophisticated. So street art is about all of these things. This is the context, this is the meaning of it, and some of the intent, really. It is illegal. You can be arrested for it still. It defaces something, and usually the defacement has to do, it's for a reason. It's a statement. Some people think it's threatening. Sometimes it's very political. It's funny, and I'll show you some of that. Confuses some people, like why is it done in the first place? Here's an old one. This actually looks three-dimensional. Some very talented people doing this. And this guy is interesting. He's Fujita. He's in the book. He has mixed some of his ancient ancestry with some of his background, which was gang related. You can see bullets here, bullet holes, and he's taken this this very familiar typeface of fighting, and this is on all of his work, the urban look here, and then the idea of fighting but with samurai, and those images look very much like old ancient fighting. And then the last one, you may have heard of him. He is becoming more and more known. He is a British street artist. He's anonymous to this day. Nobody knows who he is, and he is very active out there. This is just, I'll show you a couple examples. His sayings have a real punch, I think. If graffiti changed anything, it would be illegal. He either has spray paint words like this, and he uses rats pretty often. There's a little handprint there. Sometimes he signs them, and sometimes he don't, but it doesn't. But if this is here, and this might even be part of it. They're always just, they show up, and he has to do these very quickly. This is a stencil. Here's another very famous one of his. Sorry. A tank, so it looks like it's about to shoot, and here is a guy who's throwing flowers, and I've seen that many times. Some of these still exist. This one is pretty hard to look at. Starving kids in a garbage dump trying to find food, and yet he's wearing this, it's very ironic here, he's wearing a t-shirt that other countries, they, you know, when they gather t-shirts from people here, they end up over in developing countries for clothing, and you see these clothing on kids like Nike and things, but with these really bizarre sayings on them that are very ironic, that they were wearing these things with sayings on them that are having to do with us, not them. Now, if you want to, you can cut and paste this. If you actually have this, the ability, some of these are active and some aren't, and it's a very interesting, pretty powerful, short, intense video of Banksy's work with some music in it. Here's something I really like that I've heard. I found this on the internet. It's something that people typically say. They'll say, art, anyone can do it. Particularly certain pictures, like if somebody spatters paint on a canvas, I hear that a lot. My kid can do it, anybody can do it. And here's a response, but you didn't. Now I want you to define creativity. That's your first essay. That's your first assignment. And I want you to have a nice day. So just look through this, and I'm going to try to do some more recordings to keep you busy. Thank you.